Hello and welcome to day 31 of our daily Bible reading. Today we'll be looking at the book of Exodus, chapters 28 to 29, and the book of Acts, chapter 7. Now, in 28 and 29, we are continuing the reading of instructions for what resources to have for worship. Yesterday, we looked at the materials needed to build a portable tent or gathering place for worship. Today, we're going to be looking at the details of what the priest should be wearing. Some fancy headgear, some fancy jewelry and garments. Now, I don't want to get too caught up in the exact details of what the priests are going to be wearing, but I think what is important here is that the priests were wearing something different from everyone else. So when the priests put on these garments, everyone knew, including the priests, that they were doing the work of God. They were God's mouthpiece at this time. They were doing God's ministry in the world. And so it was a way of setting the priests apart, but also helping the priests remember that they are not their normal selves, that when they are in these garments, they are doing special work on behalf of the people in their relationship with God. Now, one detail that might catch your attention is the bells on the bottom of the robes for the priest that's going to be going into the Holy of Holies. Now, it was very limited who could go into the Holy of Holies, and there was a sense that if you were not worthy and you went in there, that you would drop dead. And there are some stories of people who went in and died. There are some stories of priests who went in with a rope around their ankles, so if something happened to them, they could be pulled out without someone else going in and being in danger. So the bells were on the robes so that if the priest dropped dead and stopped moving, you would hear that he was no longer moving and that something needed to be done. Now, this seems harsh and a little weird, but keep in mind that this was a group of people who had seen God do big, powerful things, especially as they were being freed from the power of Egypt. And they had seen a lot of magicians and other types of priests working in the temples in Egypt, doing some pretty spectacular things. The people of Israel knew that God was powerful and that we needed to have our heart in the right place, that we were obedient to God, we were listening to God's instructions and obeying God's commandments. And so there was a sense that the priests needed to be pure of heart, that they needed to have their hearts and minds focused on the things of God in order to properly serve both God and the people and to represent the people appropriately before God in the Holy of Holies part of their worship space. So this is a different way of thinking about our relationship with God. These days we think of it as a much closer personal relationship to Jesus with a lot less of this awe and reverence and scary power part. But this is God who created the whole universe. God has the power to strike people down who are not taking God seriously, who are not properly revering God. So it is something to think about and contemplate for our lives today. How do we come before God? Do we prepare our hearts and minds before we come to God? Are we, as some used to say, in a right place for approaching God? And I think there's something for us to apply in our lives, that we should perhaps take our time with God a little more seriously and prepare ourselves a little bit more for our time with God. There are also some instructions for how to consecrate the priests or ordain the priests, to let the community know that this is a person who has studied and prepared and now has the credentials and the correct frame of mind and a heart to be serving God and the community in this religious role. The last section of this part of Exodus talks about a daily burnt offering that is instructed to be given to God every day in the morning and the evening. A lot of this was standard offering procedures for a lot of religious practices of the day. But a big part for the Israelites was that this was a way for them every day to remember what God had done for them, that they had been oppressed and living a miserable life in Egypt, and God had come and heard their cries and released them and brought them to a place of freedom and a new relationship with God. And so the daily offerings were a way to maintain that relationship and continue to grow together between God and God's people. When we turn to Acts, we continue the story of Stephen, and we finish the story of Stephen. He is questioned by the religious authorities, and to explain himself, Stephen starts with the story of Abraham, and he lays down how Jesus is the fulfillment of God's relationship, starting with Abraham, going through Isaac and Jacob and Joseph, the time in Egypt, bringing Moses out of the desert to lead the people out of Egypt. And then we had Joshua and David and Solomon in the building of the temple. At the end of this, Stephen straight out accuses the people around him of treating prophets badly, just like people in the Old Testament did, and ignoring the words of the Holy Spirit in their lives at that time. The crowd got so upset they dragged Stephen out of town and stoned him to death. As he was dying, Stephen stayed focused on God and asked God not to blame the people for their sins. So this is the end of the life of Stephen. He is the first of the disciples to be killed for his faith. One of the interesting pieces of this story is there's a guy named in the crowd who is watching and encouraging and supporting the killers. His name is Saul, and he is an up and coming rising star in the Jewish religious establishment. He's a young man at the time, and he is very supportive of the persecution of the early believers. This man will go on to have his own vision of Jesus on his way to Damascus, and his name will be changed from Saul to Paul, and we will know him as St. Paul, the missionary who spread the gospel around half of the Mediterranean basin. So it is interesting to see that he is present at the death of Stephen, and he is clearly an enemy of the early church and the early believers of Jesus. But this reminds us that no matter what we have done in our lives, no matter what we have believed, no matter what positions we've taken, how we've lived our lives, there is always the opportunity that Jesus will come and speak to any one of us and turn us in a new direction, to follow a new journey, and to perhaps bring the grace and love of Jesus Christ to a new group of people that we may not even expect in our lives. Here ends the readings from Exodus and Acts for today. I hope you've learned something interesting, and I look forward to seeing you next time.